about serving Hashem out of love. The Rambam's description that even though serving Hashem out of fear is valid, and one gets credit for one's mitzvos, but it's not ideal. And it's not ideal because it has a personal, selfish benefit in mind. The person is doing mitzvos in order to get reward. He's refraining from transgressions in order not to get punished. And that's valid because Hashem set up the rewards and punishments. And Hashem set them up in part to be motivation for doing what you're doing. Still, that's not the ideal. So, the ideal is to do it out of love and only out of love. And even though one definitely must have both love and fear for God, fear or awe, one must have both of those attitudes. They're both positive commandments. But when it comes to choosing to do a mitzvah, the choice to do the mitzvah on the highest level would be to choose to do it out of love and not out of fear. Even though fear is normally an obligation, a motivation, and the idea of fear where it's based on the selfish payoff, the selfish payoff will come. Rambam says it explicitly, but that shouldn't be part of why you do it. And we said that free will implies that you have this ability. Because if free will didn't imply you have the ability to go beyond simply the motivations you have, then you wouldn't be deciding at the moment. It would just be a playoff of the different motivations, for and against. And like resolving forces in high school physics, you'd be able to calculate what the person's going to do. And it would be because of the motivations that are moving him, not because of the decision that he makes. So what the Rambam is saying is realistic psychologically and is built into the fabric of free will, to be able to say, yes, I know I want that, and yes, I know when I do this mitzvah, I will get that. But no, I'm not doing it because of that benefit I will get. That benefit I will get is not part of the motivation for my doing this action. That has to be possible, even though it's a bit surprising. And that, I think, is what the Rambam is saying. You got a question?
So, I actually really liked the much you gave yesterday where you're saying, like, if your father, you wouldn't want to do something against what your father was saying, but how are we going to balance fear in with love if we're trying to feel like that we're hurting Hashem by doing whatever we're doing, or, trying to make him more kavod for the mitzvahs that we do? How do we balance the fear in with the...
Well, that aspect I didn't mention yesterday. Nothing I said touched on that aspect. That's a very august aspect. The idea that, not that I am afraid of being punished, but that my transgression will cause pain to the Shekhinah, that's very exalted. The truth is that there's some discussion among the Rishonim, which is the highest level of service of God, love or fear, awe. Rambam says here it's love. Others say that there's a higher level. Maharal talks about it. Yes, the Ramchal says love. It's a secret that very few people know. The Ramchal follows the Rambam a lot, dozens and dozens of times, in philosophical issues, in presentation and analysis, and in decisions. He follows them. So I have from my Chavrusa, Beryl Gershenfeld, when we started learning together 40 years ago. And the Ramchal was a Kabbalist, and the Rambam, so far as we know, was not a Kabbalist. And he pointed out that the Ramchal never quotes the Ramban, which is really shocking. The Ramban is the biggest voice of Kabbalah among the Rishonim who wrote in Nigla about things, and never mentions it. So I have a theory about that, but I'm not going to go through that now. At any rate, the Rambam is saying here that having awe for God is one thing, And serving him out of love is higher than serving him out of the awe that you have. You must have the awe. It's a mitzvah to have the awe and the fear. But that shouldn't be the way you serve him. And that's what I said about the two sons yesterday. The son who loves his father and serves his father out of love, it's not that he lacks duty and responsibility and fairness and living up to obligations and moral indebtedness. Not that he lacks those qualities. But that's not what's moving him to get out of his bed at 2:30 in the morning to go to his father. What's moving him is his love. You could even say, if he didn't love his father, then he would do it for those reasons. But given that he does love his father, that's not why he's doing it.
So you're saying it's more of like an underlying factor?
It's not, that's right. It's a feature in his personality. It's a real feature in his personality. But when it comes to mitzvos and aveiros, that's not what motivates him to act. Maybe I can make it more palatable with an easier example. Most people don't want to be prosecuted in court and go to jail. I think that's fair. That in itself would be a reason for paying your taxes, because otherwise you might get prosecuted and go to jail. There are people who pay their taxes because it's the right thing to do. Even if no one would get caught, they would still do it because it's the right thing to do. And of course, he also doesn't want to go to jail. Now, does that follow that when he pays his taxes, part of what's moving him to pay his taxes is the fear of going to jail? I don't think so. I don't think so. He knows he's not going to be prosecuted for that. But that's not what's moving him. Might move somebody else, but in his case, what's moving him is his recognition that it's an obligation and he should fulfill it. So I don't think it's unrealistic at all psychologically. It's just sort of not, you don't naturally think of it that way. So the Rambam goes on to discuss the same subject. It's also from chapter 10 of the Laws of Tshuvah. The sages of the previous generations declared, should one say, I will study Torah in order to become wealthy, in order that I should be called rabbi, or in order to receive reward in the world to come? Well, given everything that he said up until now, obvious answer to that is no. But here he wants to prove it with a verse. The Torah teaches, in the second paragraph of the Shema, if you are careful to observe my commandments, to love God. Implying that all that you should do should only be done out of love. Now, verses are subject to various interpretations. I don't think one's required to interpret the verse the way the Rambam does. It could be understood as, if you are careful to observe my commandments, first of all, to love God, second of all, to do other things, and think of it as a list. But the Rambam is not reading it that way. He's reading it as, if you are careful to observe my commandments, to love God. So, the observing of the commandments, plural, is loving God. That's the way he's reading it. And that means, it would be, as he said, that verse is telling you, that's what should be done for the 15th time. Not that if you do it on a lower level, it's not valid, it's not good, and it's not right. It's just that this is the ideal. This is the best way in which one should serve God. Sages also said, the verse says, desire his commandments, and the sages comment, desire his commandments, not the reward which comes with the commandments. Which means, if you desire the commandment as the commandment per se, then you're not doing it for something else. You're doing it because that's something which is desired. In a similar manner, the great sages would command the more understanding and brilliant among their students in private, do not be like servants who serve their master for the sake of receiving a reward, which is half of a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. Rather, since he is the master, it's fitting to serve him. That means to serve him out of love. He's not bringing the second half of the Mishnah. I'm happy that he isn't, because the second half of the Mishnah has two formulations, and one of them is very hard for me to understand, even though it is one of the formulations that's given. But anyway, he's bringing only the first half here. Don't do it for the sake of reward. Now, if he says that the great sages would command only a subclass of their students in private, that means not that, and everybody else is going to hell. Too bad, forget about it. No, what it means is this is a very, very high accomplishment. If you say this in general and public to everybody, people are going to get to go into despair. I'll never manage it. My life is worthless. Why should I even try? And you want to avoid that negative impression, because their service is valid and they will be getting a reward for what they do. But when you see one who's capable of reaching for more, this is what you should teach him. And now he adds a comment which I think underpins what we've said before. Anyone who occupies himself with the Torah in order to receive a reward or to protect himself from retribution, which is level B, is considered as one who is not occupied for God's sake. The word "the" is not right here. Why for God's sake? In other words, if it's for the sake of a reward, it's not only not ideal, but there's something out of balance. There's an incoming missile, and Joe is running Iron Dome. Just come on. Okay, off it goes, bang! He says, "I love that bang. Oh man, I love that bang. I have the greatest job in the world. I get to make that bang all the time. Boy, I can recommend, if you like bangs, work here. This is it. This is really the top." Hey, Joe, do you realize that you're saving lives when you make that bang? You're preventing destruction. Lives. Destruction, don't bother me. It makes a bang. Wouldn't you think there was something wrong there? I mean, he is saving lives, but that doesn't move him. Saving lives doesn't move him. No, it's just a bang. So you understand that there's something wrong with a person like that. Or my other example is the windows in the Louvre Museum are stuck open, and the wind is blowing through, and there's a lot of papers around, and you have papers on your desk, and they're all in order, and you don't want to blow. I gotta find a paperweight to put on the papers so they won't blow. There's that canvas hanging on the wall. That just happens to be the Mona Lisa, right? Okay, there's a canvas. Wow, that's heavy enough. That's big enough. Bring it over, Joe. Bang, he puts it on the table. Baruch Hashem. I have a way to hold the papers down so they won't fly. Now, this is considered to be one of the greatest works of art in the last, 500 years. And, no, it's a paperweight. Isn't it heavy? Yeah. Isn't the wind blowing? Yeah. So put it on the papers. No, nothing wrong with that. Nothing. No loss there. No failure there. You have an incoming missile. It's going to hit a building. You have to, and you can determine its trajectory. Either it will hit a wealthy townhouse, or it'll hit the Taj Mahal. Taj Mahal. Again, one of the greatest works of architecture in the history of the world. It says, okay, I'll flip a coin. Taj Mahal, right? Or no, townhouse. You don't realize that the Taj Mahal is special? You don't hear that? You don't see that? So here the person is being told, God wants you to do this. Oh, all right. What do I get out of it? Believe me, you get a lot. You get help in this world. You get to go to the world to come. There's enormous pleasure. Oh, sounds good. Sounds like a good deal. Okay, I'm on. And if it weren't coming from God, and if it were a dead machine, and you had to pay dues to get into a very pleasant environment, I'd also do it. It's worth it. I'll figure out how much it costs to get the money, and we'll do it just as well. So the fact that you're serving God doesn't play a role in your action. Isn't there something sort of out of balance there? It's like, again, let's go back to the father and son example. Father calls him at 2:30 in the morning and says, I need your help. $20 an hour, Dad. Sure, I need you. Okay, I'm going. $20 an hour. That's certainly almost grotesque, right? If anybody called in the middle of the night for $20 an hour, he'd go. Okay, it's out of date. $200 an hour. Fine. I made it up when it was dollars worth something. At any rate, the Rambam is saying here is not occupied for God's sake. So it's not just like, there's B and there's A, and you get a B, you don't get an A. In not getting the A, it expresses a kind of lack of appreciation. We say that when you go to do a mitzvah, especially when you make the blessing before you do the mitzvah, you should feel a sense of enormous privilege. That you are chosen to do a mitzvah which brings godliness into the world, which realizes the world's potential for a spiritual existence and spiritual expression. The other example that I'll give before we go on is the Navy SEALs. I don't know how many there are, 200, 2,000, whatever it is. And some American diplomats are captured, being held ransom. And the president calls in a group of these Navy SEALs. They said, listen, we need 3 of you to go on a very dangerous mission. It's life-threatening and dangerous in other ways to save the American diplomats. Can you imagine someone volunteering for that job? He's putting himself in danger. Was he crazy? No, I was trained to do this. I can do this better than anybody else. This is what I'm here for. So even they tell him, if we publicize your name, they're going to get information about the program. We have to keep it secret, even if you succeed. He's not doing it for fame. He's doing it because that's his place in the world. That's the contribution he can make to the world. Certainly, if someone has the opportunity to serve the Creator and that way bring the highest level of value and success to the world, that should be motivating him. If he only does it out of awe and fear, which would mean only for the sake of the personal benefit, then he's missing that dimension. Now, it is possible to slice it both ways, because since he has both awe and fear and love for God, and he could do it partly out of love and partly out of awe, and he could have it both ways. But the Rambam doesn't tolerate that. The Rambam wants it to be holy for God, meaning holy out of love and not out of awe at all. No, here he puts in the idea that it's personal. He gets something for himself. And therefore it's not totally in terms of relationship with God. That's what's the degrading factor. Okay. In contrast, anyone who occupies himself with it, that's the Torah and the mitzvahs, not because of fear, nor to receive a reward, but because of his love for the Lord of the entire earth who commanded it, is one who occupies himself in the Torah and the mitzvah for God's sake. Now, the Rambam here is giving a definition of a very, very widely used term in Hebrew, and that's lishma. If you think of it semantically, lishma, doing a mitzvah, lishma, or studying Torah, lishma literally means for its own sake. L'shem, for the sake of that. The O is osa in Hebrew. Lishma. There's a whole discussion based on Nefesh HaChaim, which I think is confused. You should study Torah for the sake of studying Torah and not for the sake of serving God. No, that's wrong. The Nefesh HaChaim never dreamt of such a thing. He's not cholik on the Rambam here. He's talking about a Rosh, which is talking about the way your mind should be consciously focused when you study Torah. Well, why would you be consciously focusing your mind that way? Because God wants you to. If God doesn't want you to do it, don't do it. Don't waste your time. Nefesh HaChaim doesn't disagree with that. But it's very interesting that he translates Lishma as out of love for the Creator who commanded it. So the Shema, even though linguistically you might translate it to say for the sake of the mitzvah, that's not what it means. It means for the sake of your relationship with the Creator whom you love. And that the love is what's motivating you. So that's very important. I haven't studied the word Lishma in all the Rishonim to find out whether any people define it differently, have a different understanding of it. But that's what the Rambam is saying here. He's defining that term self-consciously because it's a very important term in our literature. Nevertheless, our sages declared, a person should always occupy himself with the Torah, others say with Torah and mitzvos, even when it is not, for God's sake, the Shema, for out of service which is not intended for God's sake, will come service that is intended for God's sake. Oh, so this supports what I've said now already 6 times, that serving God out of awe, let's say, and for the sake of a reward, is valid. The sages say one should occupy himself with it, and one of the commentaries pays attention to the word always. A person should always occupy himself with it, not for its own sake, because that's how he'll come to do it for its own sake. Which means 2 things. It means, number 1, he's telling you, if you don't start for selfish reasons, you're not going to get to doing it for its own sake. You won't get there. And that being the case, you know that that's a universal procedure. You start with a selfish motivation, and then you graduate to selfless motivation. Now, when I first heard this statement from the Talmud a long time ago, 2 things bothered me about it. Let's see. Let's imagine a person doing something for a reward. Personal, selfish reward. Is it true that, given enough time, he will naturally grow to do it without the reward? Is that kind of natural experience in the world? I think it almost never happens. Here's Joe. He's been working for IBM for 40 years. 40 years. And now he's retiring. It's 9 a.m. to 5 a.m. at the IBM installation on Smith Avenue. He retires Friday afternoon. Do you think next Monday morning he's going to be there at 9 a.m. in his office? He's been doing it for 40 years for the money. Why didn't that graduate into doing it not for the money? Doing it lishma, for its own sake? Why didn't that happen? That never happens. He did it for the money. He got the reward. When the reward stops, the behavior stops. That's one thing that bothers me about it. The other thing that bothers me about it is it seems we have direct counterexamples, even with Torah. What about professors of Talmud who aren't religious, who don't believe in God? They just make a good living teaching Talmud. They're teaching Talmud for the money. They never graduate, never, maybe some do, but many don't, graduate to teaching Talmud for the sake of serving God. So it seems to be direct counterexamples to it. These are the 2 things that bothered me when I first heard this. It took years, some with further thought and some through reading Rav Dessler. I think I came up with answers to both questions. Let's take the second question first. Rav Dessler writes, in the name of Rosh Salanter, that when we say that you should do the mitzvah not for God's sake, we don't mean totally not for God's sake. At the very least, the person should want to come to doing it lishma, for God's sake. He knows that he's not doing it now, but he wants to get there. Well, that puts a different picture on the principle. Those professors of Talmud had no clue, had no desire whatsoever to come to teaching the Torah for the sake of the God's commandment. They didn't want to arrive at that end. That wasn't part of their life's plan, their life's goal. As long as they get paid and get a raise, they're happy. So then the counterexamples fell off right away. And at first, when I heard that, I made a mistake in understanding it. I thought it meant, okay, there's doing it without, for the sake of a reward, and then there's doing it for the sake of a reward with the intention of coming to do it without the reward. And those are two possibilities. And they're saying that this statement of Chazal only applies to the second group. And I realized that that's a mistake. Who are we talking to here? The Talmud is not telling a random Chinese person or Indonesian person or something how to live. The Torah is telling Jews how to live. In particular, the Talmud. The Talmud is telling religious Jews how to live. So the person reading this statement of the Talmud is definitely not an atheist. He's a believer, believes in Torah. Otherwise, why is he reading the Talmud? He could read comic books. Well, if he believes in God, he believes in the Torah, then he knows that doing what God commands is right. And if he knows that doing what God commands is right, he automatically has some motivation to do it for that reason. Some motivation. It's just that he has other motivations as well. And in the struggle to do the right thing, often he makes the wrong decisions. But it's not as if he's totally devoid of any lishma motivation to do it. He has some. That being the case, if he's a believer in God, a believer in the Torah, and he has some lishma motivation, of course he wants to come to do it lishma. He realizes that it's something that should be done. However, given that he has other desires and other motivations, he often makes the wrong choice. So this statement of Yisrael Salanter is simply what we would call a Gili Milsa. He's revealing to us an aspect of the situation of the person reading this dictum, which we didn't appreciate before. He automatically is someone who is wanting to come to that goal, and that's what the Talmud was talking to, and it certainly wasn't talking about those professors who don't care about it. That's one thing. But why should one think that when the reward stops, the behavior will continue? I think that I realized that certain types of life experiences reveal that. For Jewish families, the 11th commandment, which was implicit at Sinai, is, "Thou shalt teach thy children to play a musical instrument." That's just something that Jewish parents do. And some choose the violin. Brave, courageous, and blessedly self-sacrificing parents choose that the child should learn the violin. Why should I say that? Because the violin is a very tough instrument. And for the first period of time when the child is playing the violin, it's noise. It's awful noise. It's terrible. It sounds terrible. The kid's going to practice an hour a day. Practice time again? Where are my earplugs? And the child knows it's noise. The child isn't stupid. The child knows he's making noise. So why should he do that? Well, parents have payoffs. If you do that, you get to go on a trip. Do that, I'll give you pudding for supper. If you don't do it, I'll lock you in your room or something. Parents have ways of manipulating the children to get them to do these things. But after a couple of years where the child is playing music, the child goes through a transition where the child wants to make that so sound, wants to make that music. And then you don't need the incentives anymore. Why? Because music, for almost everyone, touches something in the soul. It has effects, by the way, which I don't think scientists can explain. For example, people have trouble controlling their limbs and are not only clumsy, but they make spasmodic movements out of control. When you play music, they can control their limbs. They can dance fluidly. How's that possible? Why did the convict work gangs sing? Because when you're working hard, sing. When you exercise, when you listen to music, when you're exercising, you do much more. You do much more. So that's the payoff is built in there, but when the payoff becomes internal because of the beauty of the music that you're performing. I was a musician, so I know this from the inside. So here's an example of something which, at the outset, the person's clumsy at it and doesn't understand what it can become, and has to have an incentive, but at a certain point doesn't need the incentive anymore. Same thing is true with mitzvos. Same thing is true with learning Torah. The creator who commanded the mitzvos is the creator who created the person and gave him his mental capacities and his emotional capacities, and knows that some mitzvos, many, especially the learning of Torah, takes time to become fluid enough and comfort and feeling a sense of command, a sense of competence, for it to have the internal motivation that the soul will give you. So they said, if you start off doing it not for the ideal motivation, you will come, and wanting to come to that ideal motivation, you'll come to it because it will connect with your inner nature, and then by connecting with your inner nature, you'll be able to appreciate it on its own. So I think this is a very deep statement in the Talmud. It's important to know that at least that is built into it. By the way, one of the things that you discover when you study Torah is you discover things about yourself. It's a voyage of self-discovery. The Torah says that X is true, and at first glance, you don't see it. So if you're going to stick to it, you think, well, why don't I see it? What does it have that I'm missing? You ask, and you analyze it again, and then you realize something else is in play, or that you were missing something, and you now change. So there's an element of self-discovery and self-development in studying Torah. To a certain extent, you may find that in other fields as well, but in Torah it's very prominent. Especially when you're told to do a mitzvah, and you do the mitzvah and it has consequences other than what you would have anticipated. I'll tell you a story. This really happened. There was a young woman who was a college student at a university, and she was not religious, and her family was not religious. Somehow she came in possession of Rabbi Grunfeld's book, The Sabbath, one of the classical introductions to the Sabbath, and among other things, it goes through the 39 categories of forbidden activity. She read through it, and she told me that it sounded like obsessive compulsive. You can't turn on and off a light. You can't answer a telephone call. You can't cook your breakfast. Can't take a shower. You can't write your name. What is this? And she said, I anticipated that if I were to ever do it, I would feel, number one, as if I were locked up in prison. Number two, I would feel the next time I move, I'm going to make a mistake and do something I can't do. And I would feel in torture. But she's a brave soul and an adventurous soul, and she decided she's going to try it. Now, no Shabbos meals and no Zmiros singing songs and no camaraderie with friends and no Divrei Torah, just a plain negative Shabbos. Don't do any of those things. She tried it, and she reported that after she tried it, the experience was the exact opposite of what she anticipated. Instead of feeling that I can't do, she felt I don't have to do. Much of our life is habitual. Much of our life is responding to stimuli in ways that we have sort of programmed ourselves to respond. But then we feel a necessity. Can you ignore your ringing cell phone? Can you ignore the beep that says you got a new email? Or SMS? Or WhatsApp? Can you? Can you turn it off for 24 hours on Shabbos and not look? So here, having had that blanket cut off, she felt, I don't have to. And she felt a kind of psychological freedom to introspect, to think about things deeply without interruption, and she found it to be very precious. Now, that's half the story. The other half of the story is, afterwards she went back to read the book, because now she's reading the book with an entirely different idea in mind. These are the instructions for creating that precious state of mind. So it's not OCD. So the learning of Torah is a voyage of self-discovery, and that, once you realize the impact that it has on your life, that could be the internal motivation, reinforcement for doing it, without saying I'm earning reward in the world to come or avoiding punishment. So he finished. He says, "This is what I told you yesterday. Therefore, when one teaches children, women, and most of the common people, one should teach them to serve God out of fear in order to receive a reward. Teach them on level B." And as you see, he's including some men here. So it's not men and women, that's the difference. As their knowledge grows and their wisdom increases, this secret should be revealed to them slowly, bit by bit. Listen, there's more to it, not just this. They should become accustomed to this concept gradually until they grasp it and know it and begin serving God out of love. And then he ends this part of the chapter by saying it is well known and clear matter that the love of God will not become attached within a person's heart until it becomes obsessed with it. It's a word that we used yesterday instead of obsessed. Focused, we for infatuation. With it at all times as is fitting. Now, leaving all things in the world except for this, that doesn't mean leaving them behind. It means they shouldn't compete for this constant preoccupation. They shouldn't dilute this constant preoccupation. We spoke yesterday about how certain types of psychological preoccupation go together with and reinforce other things that you do in the world. Love your Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul. In the God of the Perplexed, he talks about progress towards this goal. And he says that when a person is praying, or when he says the Shema, then he should definitely be focused on God. A step up from that is when he's learning Torah or doing any mitzvah. He didn't have that in the first step. Learning Torah, doing any mitzvah, he should be focused on God. He said, listen, I'm not asking too much. You go to business, your time with your family, I'm giving all that time to you. All that time to you. Just when you're praying to God, learning Torah, doing a specific mitzvah, then you should try to be focused on God. But then he says, that's not the highest level. The highest level is to be focused on God continuously. As I told you yesterday about Dveikus and the Rambam. Like Abraham, like the patriarchs, like Moses, like other great people, where whatever they did, it was their focusing God that not only accompanied, but dictated to them what they should do and how they should do it. So the example that I give is, let's imagine a businessman who was in the office working on his business, and one thing he's doing is negotiating a contract. There are laws about how Jews make contracts. Kosher Mishpat has laws about it. So they bring him a sample of the contract, and he says, okay. Wait a minute. If we put this in the contract, maybe we're violating the Kosher Mishpat. I can't say yes. Let me call the rabbi. Calls the rabbi, says, listen, they want to put this and this in the contract. Does the Torah say it's mutter or not? And he says, yes or no. What's going on here? He's in his business, and he's negotiating a contract, but all that is together with his focus on the Kodesh Baruch Hu. Not absent. The underlying psychological orientation is, I'm doing this to serve God. So when anything questionable comes up, and if he makes an effort and successful, automatically it's Baruch Hashem. wow, look at the gift that God gave me. And if things go badly, he says, well, I don't know, maybe I shouldn't continue. Maybe God's giving me a signal I shouldn't do it. Or maybe he just wants me to work harder. I don't know which is which. I'll call up the rabbi and I'll put it in front of him and get his advice. So that, he says, is the level of very great people, the Rambam says, like when they're doing other things and they have to do them, and they have to do them with their intelligence. You know, the halacha says that if you're working at a certain time for someone paying you by the hour, you can't take off time to do other things. You can't take off time to learn Torah. You're cheating your employer. You have to pray. There's a very short prayer that you can pray. You can't pray the whole thing. So that means that, and when you're doing it, you have to do it in such a way as to serve your employer the way the Torah wants an employee to serve his employer. So that love is something which has got to be continuous. And without that, it isn't the appropriate love of God, which he was talking about above, where he said, if you love God appropriately, then you'll automatically do everything out of love. Without that, he said before, he compared it to the love of a woman, but here he's repeating it to say that this is what it means to have the love of God in the appropriate way. See if I can give you a couple of examples, a couple of parallels to this. Let's take a ballet dancer. What's on his mind when he's doing ballet? Let's say he takes a jump. Well, one thing that's on his mind is, when I land, I don't want to break my ankle. Definitely not. Don't want to do that. But it's much more than that. One of the things the ballet dancer has in mind when he jumps is his eyebrows. Why his eyebrows? Because the jump is supposed to portray something. It's supposed to express something. Fear or jubilation or anxiety or something. And the expression on his face has to portray that. A ballet dancer is participating in a dramatic presentation. What about the position of his fingers? Limp, stiff, together, apart? He'll have a plan for that. A good ballet dancer will have a plan for that. He'll have a plan for every muscle in his body, how it's supposed to be done. Okay, now how about dancing through the dance on automatic pilot? I wonder if I should invest in AT&T. Woo! It's just, no, it won't be an inspired performance. He mustn't lose his mental focus on what he's doing. Athletes know the same thing. One of the 50% of athletic performance is psychological. And a great deal of it is focusing on what you're doing, the right kind of focus. So, it's not inappropriate under those conditions because that's what you're doing, to be totally involved in it. No one's going to say you're encouraging people to be one-dimensional. What about the richness of life? No. That's how they're using that opportunity with that one-dimensional mental set. Okay, now you say, okay, but that's when he's dancing, he's got a big life, he does lots of other things. That's true, he does. But he might not. One of the great violinists, I think, for a long period of his time, played the violin 12 hours a day, 14 hours a day. Do you pity him? He's playing for audiences all over the world. He's making recordings that millions of people are going to listen to. He's playing music in an exquisite way. Do you pity him that he doesn't have time for doubles tennis? I don't think so. He's chosen to dedicate his life to one thing, and that means that all that time he has one thing in mind, that's playing the violin and making the music. Okay, so now, from our point of view, serving the Creator embraces the whole of life. There's no time off from serving the Creator. That being the case, focusing on the Creator is something which is appropriate at all times. That, I think, gives an insight as to why the Rabbi writes that it's something which should occupy the person always. Because you're always in that Shivisi Hashem Negdi Summit. I've placed HaKadosh Baruch Hu in front of me continuously. And that's not an act of imagination, it's an act of perception. Because he's really there. The question is whether you perceive it or not. And I've made the effort, says in the beginning of the Shulchan Aruch and the Ramah, I've made the effort to make it so, to be conscious of his presence always. That's what the Rambam is, part of what the Rambam is talking about when he says that the love should be with all heart, with all soul. It means the heart should never be off track on this. Because you're always in circumstances in which this kind of experience, this kind of consciousness is appropriate. And that, then, if you have that kind of love, then naturally, that love will be what motivates a person to do mitzvahs, and then he'll be doing it really lishma, which is the highest level of serving God. Okay? Okay, tomorrow I'll give a short introduction to Yom Kippur. Wait a minute, what's today? Yeah, today's Wednesday, that's right. So tomorrow I'll give a short introduction to Yom Kippur, so that you'll have...
Can we do like a short Q&A? Because we're not going to have you for a little while.
Yeah, sure. We can do that also. Yeah, good.